Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the misty mountains and rice paddies of feudal Japan, where you'll discover that surviving even a single day in this rigid society would be about as likely as a peasant successfully arguing with a samurai about proper sword etiquette. Picture yourself waking up in a cramped wooden house in the Japanese countryside around 1600 and immediately realize that everything you think you know about personal freedom, individual expression, and basic human dignity is about to be shattered like a poorly forged katana. You're probably imagining noble samurai and peaceful Zen gardens right now. But here's the reality. Check most feudal Japanese never saw a samurai up close without immediately prostrating themselves in terror, and those Zen gardens were built by peasants who worked themselves to death, creating tranquil spaces they were forbidden to enjoy. The average person's daily routine was essentially a carefully choreographed dance of absolute submission, where one misstep could mean anything from social exile to having your head separated from your shoulders by someone whose job description included recreational beheading. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing this community span the globe, like some kind of modern feudal network, minus the brutal class oppression. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first sensation hitting you as consciousness creeps in isn't the gentle sound of birds chirping or temple bells ringing. It's the bone-deep cold of a Japanese winter seeping through wooden walls so thin they might as well to be decorative suggestions rather than actual barriers against the elements. Your house, if you can call this collection of rice paper and wishful thinking a house, provides about as much insulation as a meditation on emptiness, which is fitting, since emptiness is exactly what your stomach will be experiencing for most of today. Your sleeping arrangement consists of a thin futon laid directly on tatami mats that have absorbed months of moisture, creating a sleeping surface with the warmth and comfort of a damp meditation cushion. The tatami itself is made from rice straw and rush grass, materials that seemed like good ideas until you realize they're basically organic sponges that collect every drop of humidity while providing a 5-star hotel experience for various insects that view your bedroom as premium real estate. Before you can even think about food or relieving yourself, you must perform the morning purification ritual that makes modern morning routines look refreshingly simple. You stumble toward your small wash basin, moving carefully because your wooden floor creaks with the musical enthusiasm of a percussion instrument, and any sound that might wake your neighbors could be interpreted as inconsiderate behavior that brings shame upon your family name for generations. The purification process begins with ritual hand washing, using water so cold it makes your fingers ache within seconds. But the temperature is actually the least of your problems. The ceremony requires specific movements performed in exact sequence, while maintaining proper mental attitude, a combination of physical precision and spiritual focus that would challenge modern yoga instructors who've spent years perfecting mind-body coordination. You begin by clapping your hands twice to alert the kami spirits of your presence, though making noise during morning prayers creates a delicate balance between spiritual propriety and neighborhood courtesy that requires timing your claps to coincide with acceptable sound-making hours. The hand clapping must be crisp and clear, but not loud enough to suggest arrogance or wake sleeping family members who might not appreciate being included in your personal spiritual awakening. Next comes the mouth rinsing, which involves swishing water while mentally reciting prayers to ensure spiritual cleanliness that goes far beyond mere physical hygiene. The water itself has been sitting overnight in wooden containers that harbor bacterial colonies, but spiritual purity apparently trumps biological safety in feudal Japanese morning routines that prioritize soul cleansing over preventing waterborne illnesses. The most crucial part of morning purification involves bowing toward the household shrine while performing specific gestures that must be executed flawlessly, or risk offending ancestral spirits who take protocol violations personally. Ancient Japanese spiritual tradition held that improper morning observances could bring divine punishment, ranging from bad luck to complete family ruin, making your dawn routine literally a matter of supernatural life and death. Historians still argue whether feudal Japanese purification rituals were primarily about spiritual cleansing or social control, but the elaborate morning protocols suggest that starting your day properly required more precision than modern surgical procedures, while carrying consequences that extended far beyond personal embarrassment. The household shrine demands individual attention for each ancestral spirit, requiring you to remember names, relationships, and appropriate honorifics for deceased family members who maintain active interest in your daily behavior from whatever realm they currently inhabit. Forgetting Great-Uncle Takeshi, or mispronouncing Grandmother Hanako's posthumous title, could result in haunting that makes your difficult life even more challenging through supernatural interference. As you complete this elaborate morning ritual, while your stomach growls and your bladder protests the delay, you realize that simply waking up in feudal Japan required navigating spiritual obligations that consumed more time and mental energy than most modern people spend on their entire morning routine, and you haven't even attempted to find food yet. Your stomach announces its presence with the subtlety of a taiko drum, reminding you that breakfast in feudal Japan was less about satisfying hunger and more about consuming whatever meager sustenance your social status permitted, while your taste buds wondered what they did to deserve such punishment. You shuffle toward your family's cooking area, where yesterday's rice sits, waiting in wooden containers like edible archaeology, that's been aging in ways that would fascinate food scientists and horrify everyone else. The rice itself isn't just cold, it's achieved that distinctive texture that comes from sitting overnight in humid conditions without refrigeration, transforming from grain into something resembling small, chewy pebbles that require significant jaw strength to process. This isn't leftover rice in the modern sense. It's rice that has undergone a natural preservation process that makes each grain a tiny exercise in dental endurance while providing minimal nutritional satisfaction for the effort required to consume it. Your breakfast consists primarily of this cold, hardened rice, accompanied by pickled vegetables that have been fermenting in salt and rice bran for weeks or months, developing flavors so intense they could strip paint from temple walls. The pickling process was essential for food preservation in a society without refrigeration, but the resulting vegetables achieve acidity levels that make your mouth pucker, while introducing bacterial cultures that turn your digestive system into a fermentation experiment. The pickled radish, or takuan, glows with an unsettling yellow color that comes from turmeric and extended fermentation, creating vegetables that look like they've been artificially enhanced, but actually represent traditional preservation techniques that prioritized longevity over palatability. Each bite releases flavors that assault your taste buds with the intensity of concentrated vinegar mixed with something that died slowly in salt water. Your morning beverage options are limited to tea made from leaves that have been reused so many times they've lost most of their flavor, creating a hot liquid that provides warmth without much taste or nutritional value. Tea leaves were precious commodities that required careful rationing, so your morning tea resembles colored water more than the robust beverage modern people expect from their caffeine rituals. The tea ceremony, even in its simplified peasant form, requires specific movements and mental attitudes that transform simple beverage consumption into a meditation on impermanence and social hierarchy. You must hold your cup correctly, sip at appropriate intervals, and maintain proper posture while drinking liquid that tastes like it was strained through old socks, because even breakfast becomes an exercise in demonstrating cultural refinement despite economic limitations. Soup might supplement your morning meal, if your family's circumstances allow such luxury, though soup is a generous term for hot water with a few vegetables and perhaps a trace of miso paste that's been diluted beyond recognition. The broth provides warmth and liquid nutrition while tasting like dishwater that's been blessed by Buddhist monks who took vows of culinary poverty. The eating process itself requires mastering chopstick techniques that turn simple food consumption into a test of manual dexterity and cultural knowledge. Using chopsticks incorrectly isn't just poor table manner, it's a display of cultural ignorance that could mark you as poorly raised or possibly foreign, both of which carry social stigma that affects your family's reputation within the community. Historians still argue whether the limited variety in feudal Japanese peasant diet was due to agricultural constraints or deliberate social policies designed to maintain class distinctions, but either way, your breakfast choices were determined more by your social status than your personal preferences or nutritional needs. The timing of your meal depends entirely on the seasonal sunrise schedule and your family's work obligations, meaning breakfast happens when darkness lifts enough to see your food, rather than at any hour that might be convenient for digestion or personal preference. Feudal Japanese daily schedules were dictated by natural light and agricultural necessity rather than human comfort or optimal eating patterns. Between bites of chewy rice and sips of weak tea, you're expected to maintain gratitude for whatever food your family can provide, while mentally preparing for a day of physical labor that will burn far more calories than your meager breakfast supplies. The gap between energy expenditure and caloric intake created chronic undernourishment that affected both physical strength and mental function throughout your daily activities. The social expectations surrounding breakfast extend beyond mere consumption to include proper appreciation for your family's sacrifices in providing food, acknowledgement of the farmers who grew the rice, and recognition of the natural forces that allowed crops to grow successfully. Every meal becomes a meditation on interconnectedness that requires specific mental attitudes while you're trying to extract nutrition from ingredients that challenge your digestive system. Your breakfast companions? If any family members share the morning meal, engage in conversation that carefully avoids topics that might bring bad luck, disturb social harmony, or attract unwanted attention from neighbors who might report inappropriate discussions to local authorities. Even casual morning chat requires diplomatic skills that prioritize community peace over personal expression or honest communication about daily challenges. As you finish this austere morning feast while your stomach continues protesting the inadequate portions and challenging flavors, you realize that surviving feudal Japanese breakfast required managing hunger, maintaining cultural propriété, and expressing gratitude for food that barely qualified as nourishment, all while preparing mentally for a day of labor that would test whether your meager meal provided sufficient energy for survival. The deceptively simple task of getting dressed in feudal Japan transforms into a social minefield where every fabric choice, color combination, and accessory could determine whether you live to see another sunrise or become an object lesson in the consequences of inappropriate fashion choices. You approach your modest collection of clothing with the nervous energy of someone selecting an outfit for a job interview where the position is continued existence, and the dress code violations carry penalties ranging from public humiliation to immediate execution by passing samurai. Your clothing options are dictated not by personal preference or weather conditions, but by sumptuary laws so detailed they would make modern tax codes seem refreshingly simple. These regulations specified exactly what fabrics, colors, and styles each social class could wear, creating a visual hierarchy system where your clothing announced your status, occupation, and economic level to everyone who saw you, while simultaneously restricting your choices to whatever the ruling class deemed appropriately humble for someone of your station. The base layer of your outfit consists of a simple cotton or hemp undergarment that provides minimal warmth while absorbing whatever moisture your body produces during the day's labor. Cotton was a luxury item for most peasants, so your underclothing is more likely made from hemp fibers that have the texture of burlap and about the same level of comfort against your skin. This isn't underwear in the modern sense, it's more like wearing a sack that's been tailored to roughly approximate human shape. Your outer garment is a simple kimono, made from undyed fabric in colors that announce your peasant status to anyone with functioning eyeballs. The natural brown, gray, or beige tones aren't fashion choices. They're legal requirements that ensure you don't accidentally dress above your station and trigger the wrath of samurai, who take clothing regulations as seriously as modern people take traffic laws, except with considerably more violent enforcement mechanisms. The fabric quality of your clothing tells a story that everyone can read like a social status billboard. Rough, coarsely woven hemp marks you as a peasant or laborer, while fine silk would mark you for death if you somehow managed to acquire it illegally. The thread count of your kimono isn't just about comfort, it's about survival. In a society where wearing materials reserved for higher social classes could result in having your head removed by people whose job description included maintaining social order through recreational violence. Your obi, the sash that holds your kimono closed, must be tied in specific ways that indicate your marital status, age, and social position, while avoiding any decorative elements that might suggest you're attempting to rise above your designated place in society. The knot itself communicates information about your personal circumstances to anyone who understands the complex visual language of feudal Japanese fashion, making your belt buckle essentially a wearable autobiography that better be accurate. The length of your kimono sleeves, the width of your collar, and even the way your garment overlaps when closed all follow strict protocols that vary based on your gender, age, and social status. Getting these details wrong isn't just a fashion faux pas, it's a violation of social order that could be interpreted as rebellion, disrespect, or dangerous ambition that threatens the stability of the entire feudal system. Footwear presents another layer of social complexity, since the type of shoes you wear announces your economic status, while determining your ability to navigate various terrains throughout your day. Geta, the traditional wooden sandals, provide elevation above muddy ground, while creating distinctive clicking sounds that announce your approach to anyone within hearing distance. The quality of your geta, from rough, splintery wood to smooth, well-crafted pieces, broadcasts information about your family's economic circumstances and craftsmanship connections. Your hair arrangement follows equally strict protocols that require specific styles based on your age, marital status, and social position. Unmarried women must wear their hair in styles that indicate availability, while married women adopt arrangements that signal their domestic status. Men's hairstyles, including the partial head shaving required for certain social classes, announce their occupation and social rank, while demonstrating submission to cultural expectations that prioritize group conformity over individual expression. Historians still argue whether feudal Japanese dress codes were primarily about maintaining social order or generating revenue through fines and confiscations, but the elaborate clothing regulations suggest that getting dressed successfully required more legal knowledge than modern fashion requires, while carrying consequences that extended far beyond social embarrassment. Accessories like fans, hair ornaments, or small personal items must be chosen carefully to avoid suggesting wealth above your station, while still maintaining the basic dignity required for social interaction. Even carrying a simple comb or hand mirror could be interpreted as vanity inappropriate for your social class, making personal grooming a careful balance between basic hygiene and dangerous self-regard. The seasonal appropriateness of your clothing choices follows cultural calendars that dictate when specific fabrics, colors, and styles become acceptable or forbidden, regardless of actual weather conditions. Wearing summer fabrics too early or winter clothes too late marks you as culturally ignorant or socially tone-deaf, both of which reflect poorly on your family's ability to raise properly educated children who understand seasonal propriety. As you finally achieve what you hope is an appropriately humble and legally compliant ensemble, you realize that getting dressed in feudal Japan required more cultural knowledge than most modern people possess about their own society's customs, while the stakes for fashion mistakes included consequences that make modern workplace dress codes seem refreshingly forgiving by comparison. Stepping outside your humble dwelling means entering a social battlefield where every bow, gesture, and spoken word must navigate the treacherous waters of feudal Japan's rigid hierarchy system that makes modern corporate politics look like a friendly playground game. Your morning interactions require mastering bowing protocols so complex that anthropologists are still studying their nuances, while one miscalculated degree of head inclination could trigger social consequences that destroy your family's standing in the community for generations. Your first encounter is with a neighbor whose exact social status relative to yours requires careful calculation based on factors including their family lineage, occupation, land ownership, age, and current favor with local authorities. This isn't simple neighborly greeting, it's a diplomatic negotiation that must acknowledge their position while maintaining your own dignity within the narrow parameters that feudal society allows for peasant self-respect. The bow you perform must be precisely calibrated. Too shallow, and you're showing disrespect. Too deep, and you're either mocking them or suggesting they're far above your station in ways that might not be accurate. The verbal greeting follows equally complex protocols that require acknowledging the weather, the season, their family's health, and various other social pleasantries while carefully avoiding any topics that might be interpreted as gossip, political commentary, or inappropriate curiosity about their personal affairs. Ancient Japanese social conversation was essentially a verbal minefield where every phrase had to be evaluated for its potential to cause offense, spread rumors, or accidentally reveal information that could be used against you later. The language itself changes based on the social relationship between speakers, with different vocabulary, verb forms, and levels of politeness required for different social situations. Speaking to someone of higher status requires using honorific language that elevates them while diminishing yourself. But getting the level wrong could be interpreted as either insufficient respect or sarcastic mockery, both of which carry serious social consequences in a society where verbal mistakes could result in physical punishment. Your posture during conversation must demonstrate appropriate deference while maintaining enough dignity to avoid suggesting mental deficiency or extreme social anxiety that might make you unreliable for community obligations. The angle of your back, the position of your hands, and even where you direct your gaze all communicate messages about your attitude towards social hierarchy and your understanding of proper behavioral protocols. When a traveling merchant approaches, the social calculation becomes even more complex because their economic status might be higher than yours, while their social class remains lower, creating a hierarchy conflict that requires diplomatic skills worthy of international negotiations. You must acknowledge their economic success without suggesting they deserve social respect equal to their wealth, while simultaneously avoiding insults that might affect their willingness to conduct business in your community. The most dangerous social encounter comes when you notice a samurai approaching from down the village path. Your immediate response must be to prostrate yourself completely, dropping to the ground in a position that demonstrates absolute submission, while hoping that your display of proper respect will be sufficient to avoid attracting their attention. Samurai possessed the legal right to kill peasants who showed insufficient respect, making every encounter with warrior-class individuals a potential death sentence that could be triggered by something as simple as making eye contact or failing to bow quickly enough. The prostration itself requires specific positioning that shows complete submission without appearing theatrical or mocking. Your forehead must touch the ground while your hands remain visible, and your body position demonstrates that you pose no threat and acknowledge their absolute authority over your existence. Remaining in this position until the samurai passes requires physical endurance and mental discipline, since moving too soon could be interpreted as disrespect, while staying down too long might suggest you're performing for attention. Historians still argue whether the extreme deference required in samurai-peasant interactions reflected genuine social beliefs or was simply practical survival strategy, but the documented cases of peasants being killed for minor protocol violations suggest that treating warrior class encounters as life or death situations was entirely reasonable. The village hierarchy extends beyond individual encounters to include complex webs of obligation and social debt that affect every interaction with community members. Your family's relationships with neighbors, local craftsmen, and village officials create a network of social responsibilities that must be maintained through proper greetings, appropriate gifts, and careful attention to everyone's changing circumstances and status within the community. Children in the village require different greeting protocols based on their family's status, with offspring of higher-ranking families deserving more respect than your own social position might normally warrant. Teaching your children to navigate these social complexities begins early, since improper behavior toward other families' children could create conflicts that affect community harmony and your family's reputation. Even the timing of your social interactions follows unspoken rules that take into account work schedules, meal times, religious observances, and various other factors that determine when approaching different community members is appropriate versus intrusive. Moving through your village requires constant awareness of social rhythms that prioritize group harmony over individual convenience or personal preferences. As you navigate this maze of social protocols while trying to accomplish basic daily tasks, you begin to understand why feudal Japanese society produced individuals who were extraordinarily skilled at reading social cues and maintaining group harmony, though the psychological cost of such constant social vigilance would challenge modern mental health professionals who consider authentic self-expression essential for psychological well-being. The moment the sun clears the horizon, your workday begins with the enthusiasm of a death march, as you join the ranks of peasants whose lives are considered so expendable that feudal lords plan agricultural schedules with the same casual disregard for human welfare that modern people show when deciding which weeds to pull from their gardens. Your morning labor starts in rice paddies that require you to wade knee-deep in water teeming with leeches, parasites, and various microorganisms that view your exposed skin as prime real estate for establishing new colonies while you perform back-breaking work that would violate every modern labor law ever conceived. The rice cultivation process demands that you spend hours bent over in water that's equal parts irrigation fluid and biological soup, transplanting individual rice seedlings with precision that would challenge modern agricultural engineers, while your lower back screams in protest and your feet slowly go numb from standing in cold water that harbors creatures specifically evolved to make human contact as unpleasant as possible. Each seedling must be planted at exact depths and spacing to ensure maximum yield, because failing to meet rice production quotas could result in your entire family being sold into slavery or executed for failing to fulfill their agricultural obligations to distant lords who measure peasant value strictly in terms of grain production. The tools available for this agricultural torture session consist of primitive implements that make modern gardening equipment seem like space-age technology. Your hoe is essentially a sharpened stick attached to another stick, designed by someone who apparently believed that farming should be as physically punishing as possible while still producing food. The wooden blade dulls quickly against rocks hidden in the muddy fields, requiring constant resharpening with stones that you must carry yourself, adding tool maintenance to the growing list of tasks that consume your limited energy. The irrigation system that feeds these rice paddies operates through a complex network of channels and gates that require constant maintenance by the same peasants who work the fields, creating additional labor obligations that extend your workday beyond the already exhausting requirements of rice cultivation. Cleaning irrigation channels involves removing accumulated silt, debris, and occasional dead animals, while standing waist-deep in water, that contains every disease-causing organism that lives in rural Japanese watersheds. Your work is overseen by village officials who answer to regional lords, who report to higher authorities in a chain of command that stretches all the way to feudal lords, who have never touched a rice plant, but possess absolute power over everyone involved in producing their wealth. These overseers carry bamboo sticks that they use to encourage productivity among workers who show signs of fatigue, illness, or insufficient enthusiasm for agricultural labor that slowly destroys their bodies while enriching people they will never meet. The physical demands of rice farming create injuries and health problems that accumulate over time, turning young peasants into prematurely aged individuals whose bodies break down from repetitive stress, constant exposure to water, and nutritional deficiencies that prevent proper healing. Your ankles swell from standing in water, your hands develop permanent calluses that crack and bleed, and your spine compresses from hours of bent-over labor that gradually transforms your posture into a permanent question mark. Weather conditions add another layer of misery to agricultural work that must continue, regardless of temperature, precipitation, or seasonal storms that make outdoor labor dangerous for anyone foolish enough to value their personal safety over rice production schedules. Working in freezing rain while transplanting seedlings tests the limits of human endurance, while demonstrating the feudal system's complete indifference to peasant comfort or survival. The growing season follows a relentless calendar that demands specific tasks be completed within narrow time windows, regardless of worker illness, family emergencies, or personal limitations that might interfere with agricultural schedules designed to maximize yield rather than preserve human health. Missing planting deadlines or falling behind in field maintenance could result in reduced harvests that trigger punishment for entire families who failed to meet production expectations. Historians still argue whether the intense labor demands of feudal Japanese agriculture were necessary for survival or deliberately excessive to maintain social control, but the documented cases of peasants working themselves to death during critical agricultural periods suggest that the farming schedule prioritized rice production over human life in ways that would shock modern agricultural workers. The tax collection system that motivated this agricultural intensity operated on principles that would make modern revenue agencies seem compassionate by comparison. Feudal lords typically claimed between 40 and 60% of all rice production as taxes, leaving peasant families with barely enough grain to survive, while creating incentives for overwork that frequently proved fatal. The phrase, "the nail that sticks up gets hammered down," originated in this agricultural context, where individual peasants who couldn't maintain productivity levels became examples for others about the consequences of insufficient dedication to rice cultivation. Break times during agricultural work are determined by overseer generosity rather than worker needs, meaning that rest periods might occur during the hottest part of the day when work becomes physically impossible, or might be skipped entirely when production schedules demand continuous labor that pushes human endurance beyond reasonable limits. Your afternoon meal, if provided, consists of whatever food can be consumed quickly while standing in rice paddies, creating dining experiences that combine malnutrition with occupational hazards. As the morning work period continues and your body protests the combination of physical stress, environmental exposure, and inadequate nutrition, you begin to understand why life expectancy for feudal Japanese peasants rarely exceeded 40 years, and why agricultural productivity was maintained through a constant supply of young workers who hadn't yet been broken by the demands of rice cultivation that treated human beings as disposable farming equipment. When injury or illness strikes during your agricultural laborand, it will strike. Because working in disease-infested water with primitive tools, while malnourished, makes bodily harm. As inevitable as sunrise, you discover that feudal Japanese medicine combines legitimate herbal knowledge with treatments so bizarre. They make medieval European bloodletting seem scientifically advanced. Your aching back from hours of bent-over rice planting leads you to seek out the village healer, a combination doctor, herbalist, and spiritual advisor whose medical training consisted of memorizing ancient Chinese texts while adding local folk remedies that range from surprisingly effective to actively lethal. The diagnostic process begins with the healer examining your tongue, pulse, and various other physical signs while consulting charts that correlate bodily symptoms with imbalances in your spiritual energy, seasonal influences, and relationships with ancestral spirits who might be expressing displeasure through your physical discomfort. Ancient Japanese medicine operated on the theory that illness resulted from disrupted harmony between your body, mind, spirit, and environment, creating a holistic approach that was either brilliantly comprehensive or completely useless depending on whether your problem had physical or supernatural causes. Your back pain diagnosis involves determining whether your suffering stems from physical strain, spiritual imbalance, or punishment for moral failings that have disrupted your body's natural harmony with cosmic forces. The healer's examination includes questions about your recent behavior, family relationships, and religious observances. Because ancient Japanese medicine held that physical symptoms often reflected spiritual problems that required correction before bodily healing could occur. The prescribed treatment begins with acupuncture, using needles that have been cleaned with methods that prioritize spiritual purification over bacterial sterilization, creating therapeutic procedures that occasionally provided genuine relief, while sometimes introducing infections that proved more dangerous than the original complaints. The needle insertion points follow traditional maps of energy pathways that may or may not correspond to actual anatomy, making acupuncture sessions essentially gambling with your nervous system while hoping that ancient wisdom proves more reliable than modern understanding of human physiology. Herbal remedies form the backbone of feudal Japanese medicine, ranging from genuinely effective plant extracts that modern pharmacology has validated to bizarre concoctions that would poison laboratory rats if anyone were foolish enough to test them scientifically. Your back pain treatment includes consuming tea made from willow bark, which actually contains compounds similar to modern aspirin mixed with ground tiger bones, that someone claimed would transfer feline strength to your injured muscles, though the effectiveness of extinct animal parts as medicine remains questionable at best. The pharmacy available to feudal Japanese healers included ingredients that sound like shopping lists, compiled by individuals with questionable judgment and unlimited access to dangerous substances. Mercury was prescribed for various ailments despite its obvious toxicity, while powdered rhinoceros horn was considered essential for treating everything from fever to impotence, creating medical practices that simultaneously depleted wildlife populations and poisoned patients who trusted ancient wisdom over observable results. Moxotherapy involves burning small cones of dried mugwort directly on your skin at specific acupuncture points, creating controlled burns that supposedly stimulate healing energy while definitely creating actual burns that require their own medical attention. The procedure combines the therapeutic benefits of systematic tissue damage with the psychological effects of voluntary self-torture, making moxibustion either a brilliant application of controlled trauma or elaborate masochism disguised as healthcare. Prayer scrolls serve as primary medical interventions for serious illnesses that exceed the healer's pharmaceutical capabilities, creating treatment plans that rely more on divine intervention than medical science. These paper prescriptions contain written prayers that must be consumed by mixing the ink with water and drinking the resulting solution, making religious texts literally digestible medicine that treats spiritual causes of physical ailments through direct consumption of holy words. Historians still argue whether traditional Japanese medicine was based on empirical observation or purely spiritual beliefs, but the survival rate for serious illnesses suggests that patients often recovered despite their treatments rather than because of them. though the placebo effect of elaborate medical rituals may have provided psychological benefits that supported natural healing processes. Surgical procedures in feudal Japan demonstrated remarkable skill, combined with terrifying ignorance of sterile technique and anesthesia. Japanese surgeons could successfully remove cataracts, repair complex bone fractures, and even perform abdominal surgery, but they accomplished these feats using instruments cleaned with sake and techniques that relied on patient endurance rather than pain management. The success rate for major surgery was surprisingly high considering the complete absence of modern medical knowledge, though this might reflect the fact that only the healthiest patients survived long enough to attempt such procedures. Mental health treatment consisted primarily of exorcism rituals designed to drive out evil spirits that were believed to cause psychological disturbances, creating psychiatric care that involved more religious ceremony than medical intervention. Depression was interpreted as spiritual possession, while anxiety was treated through meditation practices that might actually have provided therapeutic benefits if patients could survive the accompanying dietary restrictions and social isolation that accompanied mental health. Treatment. Preventive medicine in feudal Japan focused heavily on maintaining spiritual purity through ritual cleansing, dietary restrictions, and behavioral modifications that may have accidentally promoted good health while pursuing supernatural goals. The emphasis on cleanliness, moderation in eating, and regular meditation probably contributed to better health outcomes than the specific medical treatments available when prevention failed to keep illness at bay. As you leave the healer's practice with your prescription for willow bark tea, tiger bone powder, and prayers to consume if your back pain worsens, you realize that surviving feudal Japanese healthcare required the same combination of luck, divine favor, and stubborn constitution needed for every other aspect of daily life. In a civilization where medical treatment was just another form of gambling, with forces beyond human understanding or control, the midday heat has broken just enough to make eating bearable, though bearable is a generous description when your lunch consists of rice so plain it makes cardboard seem flavorful, accompanied by dining customs so intricate that improper chopstick technique could be interpreted as a declaration of war against everything your ancestors held sacred. You settle into whatever shade you can find for your afternoon meal, completely unaware that you're about to navigate social protocols that make modern business dinners look like casual picnics, where the only consequence of poor etiquette is mild embarrassment rather than family dishonor, lasting multiple generations. Your lunch begins with rice that has been sitting since morning in wooden containers that provide ideal growing conditions for bacterial cultures while offering no protection against the flies that view your meal as a convenient landing strip between visits to various unsanitary locations throughout the village. This isn't just leftover rice sites, rice that has undergone a natural fermentation process that changes its texture and flavor in ways that challenge your digestive system while testing your ability to maintain grateful expressions for food that barely qualifies as edible. The chopstick protocols governing your meal are so complex, they require more mental concentration than the food itself warrants, transforming simple eating into a cultural examination where every gesture communicates messages about your upbringing, social awareness, and respect for traditions that treat dining implements as sacred tools rather than mere utensils. Holding your chopsticks incorrectly isn't just poor table manners, it's a display of cultural ignorance that reflects poorly on your entire family's ability to raise properly educated children who understand basic civilized behavior. The specific positioning of your chopsticks, when not in use, follows rules that would challenge geometry students, since placing them incorrectly on your rice bowl could accidentally create arrangements associated with funeral rituals and death ceremonies. Crossing your chopsticks, pointing them at other people, or sticking them vertically into your rice transforms innocent dining actions into ominous spiritual gestures that invoke mortality themes during what should be peaceful meal times. Your eating pace must demonstrate appropriate appreciation for the food, while avoiding suggestions of either gluttony or insufficient enthusiasm for whatever sustenance your family has managed to provide. Eating too quickly implies greed or poor upbringing, while eating too slowly suggests either dislike for the food or pretentious attempts to appear refined beyond your actual social station. The correct eating rhythm requires constant monitoring of your consumption speed to maintain the narrow, acceptable range between apparent hunger and affected delicacy. The conversation during your meal must carefully avoid topics that might bring bad luck, disturb digestion, or create social conflicts that affect community harmony. Discussing illness, death, financial problems, or family disputes during meals was believed to contaminate food with negative spiritual energy, making dinner conversation essentially a verbal obstacle course, where every topic required evaluation for its potential to poison both food and social relationships. Sharing food involves complex protocols that take into account age hierarchies, gender roles, and social relationships within your dining group. The order in which people receive food, the portions they're offered, and even the specific dishes they're allowed to eat, all follow established patterns that reinforce social structure while ensuring that everyone understands their position in the family and community hierarchy through daily dining experiences. Your soup, if your family's circumstances allow such luxury, must be consumed using techniques that demonstrate cultural knowledge while avoiding sounds that suggest poor breeding or excessive enthusiasm for liquid nourishment. Slurping soup is actually encouraged in Japanese dining culture because it aerates the broth and enhances flavor, but the volume and timing of your slurping must fall within acceptable ranges that show appreciation without suggesting animal-like feeding behavior. The vegetables accompanying your rice have been pickled using traditional methods that preserve them, while creating flavors so intense they could function as natural preservatives for anything else they contact. These pickles aren't just side dishes, they're essential sources of vitamins and minerals that prevent nutritional deficiency diseases, though consuming them requires developing tolerance for acidity levels that would make laboratory technicians wear protective equipment. Tea consumption follows its own set of protocols that turn simple beverage drinking into meditation exercises that demonstrate cultural refinement while providing minimal actual refreshment. The temperature of your tea, the size of your sips, and even the facial expressions you make while drinking all communicate messages about your appreciation for the beverage and your understanding of proper social behavior during mealtimes. Historians still argue whether the elaborate dining customs of feudal Japan were primarily about spiritual beliefs or social control, but the detailed etiquette requirements suggest that meals served multiple functions beyond nutrition, including education in cultural values, reinforcement of social hierarchies, and practice in group conformity that extended far beyond food consumption. The cleanup process following your meal involves specific procedures for handling chopsticks, bowls, and leftover food that must be completed correctly, or risk bringing bad luck to future meals. Washing dishes requires particular attention to water conservation, since clean water was precious, while food scraps must be disposed of in ways that show respect for the farmers who produced the ingredients and the natural forces that allowed crops to grow successfully. Leftover rice cannot be wasted, because rice was considered sacred grain that deserved reverence rather than casual disposal, creating household management challenges that required creative meal planning to ensure that every grain was consumed, while avoiding the social shame associated with letting food spoil through poor kitchen management. Your afternoon meal becomes a lesson in resource conservation that extends far beyond simple hunger satisfaction. As you complete this elaborate dining ritual while your stomach remains only partially satisfied by food that challenged your taste buds and social skills equally, you realize that surviving feudal Japanese lunch required mastering cultural protocols that transformed eating from biological necessity into performance art, where mistakes carried consequences that extended far beyond personal embarrassment. The afternoon brings the arrival of tax collectors, whose presence transforms your village into a scene from a nightmare where armed bureaucrats possess legal authority to confiscate everything you own, sell your family into slavery, or simply execute you for failing to meet impossible rice quotas that were calculated by distant lords who have never seen a grain of rice, but consider peasant suffering an acceptable cost of maintaining their luxurious lifestyles. These collectors approach your modest home with the casual confidence of people who know that resistance means death, while compliance means barely surviving. Another year of systematic exploitation that treats human beings like livestock, whose only value lies in their ability to produce agricultural wealth. The tax system operates on principles that would make modern revenue agencies seem compassionate by comparison, demanding between 40 and 60% of all rice production, while adding additional levies for everything from military service to road maintenance to ceremonial expenses for festivals that peasants are forbidden to attend. Your family's rice quota was determined not by your actual production capacity, but by estimates made by officials who view agricultural planning as an abstract mathematical exercise where human survival is less important than meeting revenue targets for feudal lords who measure success, strictly in terms of grain collection efficiency. The collectors arrive with detailed records that track every aspect of your family's agricultural production, land usage, and economic activities, creating surveillance systems that would impress modern intelligence agencies while serving purposes that prioritize wealth extraction over accurate assessment of your actual ability to pay taxes without starving. These records include information about your family size, livestock ownership, tool possession, and even estimates of hidden grain stores that officials assume you're concealing to avoid taxation. Your rice stores are measured using official containers that have been calibrated to ensure maximum tax collection while providing minimal allowance for seed grain needed for next year's planting or food reserves necessary for competing, surviving winter months when agricultural production stops but human nutritional needs continue. The measuring process involves emptying your entire grain storage while collectors examine every corner of your property for evidence of hidden rice that might be concealed to avoid taxation. The collection process includes searching your home, outbuildings, and surrounding property for any valuable items that might be confiscated to supplement insufficient rice payments, transforming tax collection into comprehensive property seizure that could leave your family with barely enough possessions to maintain basic survival. Collectors possess legal authority to take livestock, tools, clothing, and even household items if rice production falls short of quota requirements. Failure to meet tax obligations triggers escalating punishments that begin with additional levies and progress through property confiscation, family enslavement, and ultimately execution for tax evasion that officials interpret as rebellion against the feudal system. The progression from financial shortfall to death sentence could happen within a single growing season, making tax collection essentially Russian roulette with agricultural economics where bad weather, crop disease, or poor yields could result in your entire family being eliminated for failing to produce sufficient rice. The collectors themselves are low-ranking officials who earn commissions based on the amount of rice they collect, creating incentive systems that reward excessive taxation while punishing compassionate assessment of peasant circumstances. These tax agents often come from peasant backgrounds themselves, but have chosen careers that involve systematically destroying other peasant families through ruthless revenue collection that prioritizes personal advancement over community welfare. Appeals against excessive taxation must be submitted through bureaucratic processes that require literacy, political connections, and financial resources that peasants typically lack, creating legal systems that appear to offer recourse while actually ensuring that tax disputes favor collectors over taxpayers. The appeal process itself involves fees and bribes that often exceed the disputed tax amounts, making legal challenges economically impossible for families already struggling to meet basic survival needs. Historians still argue whether the extreme tax burden in feudal Japan was necessary for maintaining social order or represented systematic exploitation designed to prevent peasant families from accumulating wealth that might threaten established power structures. But the documented cases of entire villages being depopulated through excessive taxation suggest that revenue collection served political purposes beyond simple government funding. The timing of tax collection coincides with harvest completion, ensuring that collectors arrive exactly when your family's grain stores are at their maximum, while providing no consideration for the months of food scarcity that lie ahead before next year's harvest. This seasonal timing creates maximum psychological pressure, while demonstrating the tax system's complete indifference to peasant survival needs that extend beyond the immediate harvest period. Village cooperation during tax collection follows patterns that prioritize community survival over individual welfare, meaning that neighbors might report hidden grain stores or undeclared livestock to redirect collector attention toward other families. The tax system creates social pressure that transforms communities into networks of mutual surveillance, where helping your neighbors avoid taxation could result in increased scrutiny of your own tax compliance. Hidden grain storage requires elaborate concealment techniques that involve constructing false walls, underground chambers, and concealed pits that might preserve emergency food supplies, while risking severe punishment if discovered by collectors who assume that any hidden grain represents deliberate tax evasion rather than prudent preparation for potential famine conditions. As the collectors complete their systematic looting of your village, while maintaining the legal fiction that this represents legitimate taxation rather than organized theft, you begin to understand why peasant rebellions periodically erupted throughout feudal Japanese history, though such uprisings typically resulted in mass executions that reminded survivors about the consequences of challenging systems designed to extract maximum wealth, while maintaining minimum peasant survival necessary for continued agricultural production. As evening shadows begin to stretch across your village like dark fingers reaching toward the mountains, you face the most spiritually treacherous part of your feudal Japanese day, navigating religious obligations that require appeasing multiple spiritual traditions while avoiding any behavior that might suggest you're practicing the forbidden Christianity that could result in crucifixion, boiling alive, or other creative execution methods that Japanese authorities developed specifically for religious dissidents. Your evening prayers become a delicate balance between maintaining proper Buddhist observances, honoring Shinto traditions, and avoiding any gestures that suspicious neighbors might interpret as Christian worship that would bring swift and horrific death to your entire family. The Buddhist elements of your evening ritual require reciting specific sutras while maintaining mental attitudes that demonstrate proper understanding of impermanence, suffering, and the illusory nature of earthly existence, philosophical concepts that seem particularly relevant when your daily life consists of barely surviving systematic exploitation by feudal lords who treat peasant suffering as entertainment. You begin by lighting incense at your family's Buddhist altar, while reciting prayers in Sanskrit that you've memorized phonetically without understanding their meaning, creating religious experiences that prioritize ritual correctness over spiritual comprehension. Your household Buddha statue receives offerings of rice, water, and whatever flowers you can gather without being accused of stealing from gardens that belong to higher status families who might interpret unauthorized flower picking as theft worthy of severe punishment. The offerings must be presented with specific gestures while maintaining proper mental attitudes of reverence and detachment, though achieving genuine spiritual detachment proves challenging when you're constantly worried about having enough food to survive until tomorrow. The Shinto aspects of your evening observances require acknowledging the kami spirits that inhabit natural features, household objects, and ancestral presences that take active interest in your daily behavior from whatever realm they currently occupy. You clap twice to alert the spirits of your presence, bow appropriately, and offer prayers for protection, good fortune, and continued family welfare, while hoping that your spiritual technique meets divine standards that were never clearly explained in any religious education available to peasants. The most dangerous part of your evening prayers involves ensuring that none of your gestures, words, or ritual actions could be interpreted as Christian worship by neighbors who might report suspicious religious behavior to authorities who consider Christianity such a serious threat to social order that they've developed torture, techniques specifically designed to force religious conversion, or extract confessions from suspected believers. Making the sign of the cross, kneeling in certain positions, or even folding your hands incorrectly could trigger investigations that typically end with public executions, designed to discourage other peasants from exploring foreign religions. The anti-Christian surveillance system operates through networks of community informants who receive rewards for reporting suspicious religious activities, creating social environments where neighbors monitor each other's spiritual practices for signs of forbidden beliefs that might indicate dangerous foreign influence. The financial incentives for reporting Christians encourage false accusations that destroy innocent families, while demonstrating government commitment to maintaining religious purity through systematic terror. Your ancestral shrine requires individual attention for each deceased family member whose spirits supposedly maintain active involvement in family affairs, while possessing supernatural abilities to influence your daily circumstances based on their satisfaction with your memorial observances. You must remember correct names, death dates, and appropriate honorifics for relatives who died before you were born, creating genealogical obligations that test your memory, while honoring people whose earthly personalities you never experienced, but whose ghostly approval apparently affects your survival prospects. The meditation component of evening prayers involves achieving mental states that Buddhist doctrine describes as essential for spiritual progress, while practical circumstances make genuine contemplation nearly impossible when you're exhausted from agricultural labor, worried about tomorrow's survival, and distracted by physical discomfort from inadequate nutrition and uncomfortable living conditions. Authentic meditation requires mental clarity that feudal Japanese peasant life systematically undermines through chronic stress and material deprivation. Historians still argue whether the religious syncretism of feudal Japan reflected genuine spiritual beliefs or political necessity, but the elaborate evening prayer routines suggest that maintaining proper relationships with multiple spiritual traditions required more time and mental energy than most modern people dedicate to their entire religious lives, while carrying consequences that extended far beyond personal spiritual welfare. The protective prayers that conclude your evening observances address the dangerous transition from day to night when malevolent spirits become more active and supernatural threats increase, according to traditional beliefs that make darkness literally dangerous for reasons beyond the practical. Concerns about wild animals, bandits, and accidents that plague nighttime activities. You're essentially praying for cosmic protection while requesting divine intervention to help you survive both earthly and supernatural dangers that feudal Japanese folklore considers equally real and threatening. The timing of evening prayers must coordinate with natural light cycles, agricultural schedules, and community expectations about appropriate religious behavior, while avoiding any deviation from established patterns that might attract unwanted attention from neighbors who view religious innovation as potential evidence of dangerous foreign influence that threatens social stability through spiritual contamination. As you complete this elaborate evening spiritual routine while maintaining constant vigilance against accidentally performing gestures that might be interpreted as Christian worship, You realize that surviving feudal Japanese religious obligations required more theological knowledge and political awareness than most modern seminary students possess, while the stakes for spiritual mistakes included consequences that make modern religious disagreements seem refreshingly civilized by comparison. Your evening meal transforms dining from simple sustenance into a potential death sentence when traveling samurai decide to honor your humble dwelling with their presence, turning your family dinner into a high-stakes performance where improper hospitality could result in having your head separated from your shoulders by guests whose code of honor requires them to kill anyone who fails to demonstrate adequate respect for their elevated social status. The moment you spot the distinctive silhouettes of armed warriors approaching your village, your stomach drops with the realization that tonight's dinner will either demonstrate your family's proper understanding of feudal etiquette or become your final meal before experiencing the cutting edge of samurai justice. The arrival of samurai at peasant households follows protocols that transform ordinary families into unwilling hosts for potentially lethal dinner guests, whose expectations for hospitality extend far beyond anything your modest circumstances can reasonably provide. These warriors possess legal authority to demand food, shelter, and service from any peasant family while maintaining honor codes that justify violence against hosts who fail to meet standards that were never clearly explained but are nevertheless enforced through immediate execution of anyone whose hospitality proves inadequate. Your family's response to samurai visitors requires instantly reorganizing your evening meal plans to accommodate guests whose dietary expectations assume access to food quality and variety that exceeds your normal monthly consumption. The rice that seemed adequate for your family dinner suddenly appears embarrassingly humble when served to warriors accustomed to meals that cost more than your annual income, while your pickled vegetables and weak tea create dining experiences that could be interpreted as deliberate insults to their elevated status. The seating arrangements for dinner with samurai guests follow complex hierarchical protocols that must acknowledge their superior social rank while maintaining household order and demonstrating your family's understanding of proper behavior in the presence of warrior-class individuals. Your best sleeping mats become dinner seating for guests who expect comfort levels that your furniture cannot provide, while your family members arrange themselves in positions that show appropriate deference without suggesting either excessive familiarity or inadequate respect. Conversation during meals with samurai visitors requires diplomatic skills that would challenge modern ambassadors, since these warriors consider themselves living embodiments of honor, whose reputation depends partly on maintaining respect from social inferiors who must acknowledge their superiority, while avoiding topics that might trigger violent responses to perceived slights. Discussing warfare, politics, or current events could accidentally reveal opinions that samurai interpret as criticism of their class, their lords, or their actions, making dinner conversation essentially a verbal minefield where casual remarks could prove fatal. The serving protocols for samurai guests involve presenting food and beverages using techniques that demonstrate cultural knowledge while showing proper respect for warriors whose social status places them so far above peasants that direct interaction requires elaborate ritual mediation. Your family members must serve food without making eye contact, speak only when directly addressed, and maintain postures that acknowledge the vast social gulf between peasant hosts and warrior guests who possess absolute power over their survival. The quality expectations for samurai hospitality assume access to luxury items that peasant families typically see only during religious festivals or special occasions, when wealthy households display their prosperity through elaborate consumption. Your evening meal, which might include whatever protein your family can afford, suddenly seems pathetically inadequate when offered to guests whose normal diet includes foods that cost more than your annual rice production, while requiring preparation techniques that exceed your kitchen capabilities. The honor code governing samurai behavior includes provisions that allow these warriors to kill hosts who provide inadequate hospitality, fail to show proper respect, or accidentally offend their sense of dignity through actions that might seem innocent to peasants who lack training in warrior class etiquette. The legal system provides no recourse for peasant families whose members are killed by samurai guests, since warrior testimony automatically outweighs peasant claims while the victim's death serves as evidence that some form of disrespect must have occurred. Historians still argue whether samurai actually killed peasant hosts with the frequency that folklore suggests, or if the threat of violence was primarily psychological warfare designed to maintain social control. But the documented cases of peasants being executed for hospitality failures suggest that treating samurai dinner guests as potentially lethal visitors was entirely reasonable survival strategy. The gift-giving expectations surrounding samurai visits assume that peasant hosts possess valuable items worthy of presentation to warrior guests, whose social status entitles them to receive tribute from social inferiors. Your family's modest possessions, which represent years of careful saving and resourceful acquisition, might be offered as gifts to samurai who expect valuable presents while possessing legal authority to confiscate anything they desire, regardless of your family's attachment to specific items. The departure protocols for samurai guests require continuing displays of respect and gratitude that demonstrate your family's appreciation for the honor of their visit, while ensuring that their final impressions remain positive, enough to prevent return visits, motivated by dissatisfaction with previous hospitality experiences. The farewell process involves elaborate bowing, verbal expressions of gratitude, and behavioral demonstrations that acknowledge the social privilege of hosting warrior-class individuals. As your potentially lethal dinner guests finally depart and your family begins cleaning up from an evening meal that could have easily become a massacre, you realize that surviving feudal Japanese hospitality customs required treating every social interaction as a potential death sentence, while maintaining the gracious demeanor expected from people whose survival depended on satisfying the sense. Arbitrary demands of heavily armed visitors who measured hospitality success through their personal satisfaction rather than objective standards of reasonable accommodation. Romance in feudal Japan operates according to principles that make modern arranged marriages seem like free-spirited love affairs, since finding a partner involves navigating family negotiations so complex they require diplomatic skills worthy of international treaties, while your personal feelings about potential spouses matter about as much as a peasant's opinion on military strategy. Your romantic future is determined entirely by arrangements made between families who view marriage as economic and social contracts, where love is not just irrelevant, but potentially dangerous to carefully planned alliances that prioritize family advancement over individual happiness or personal compatibility. The courtship process begins not with meeting someone attractive, but with your family's careful evaluation of potential marriage partners whose social status, economic prospects, and family connections might benefit your household's survival chances in a society where wrong marriage choices could destroy entire extended families through association with disgraced or economically failing lineages. Your parents examine potential spouses like livestock buyers evaluating breeding stock, considering factors that include family health history, agricultural productivity, political connections, and religious orthodoxy, while treating your romantic preferences as irrelevant complications that interfere with practical marriage planning. Your actual meeting with potential marriage partners happens only after extensive family negotiations have established preliminary agreements about dowries, living arrangements, and mutual obligations that will govern your relationship regardless of whether you develop any actual affection for the person you're expected to spend your life serving. These supervised encounters follow protocols so rigid they make modern job interviews seem casual, with both families monitoring every interaction for signs of incompatibility that might threaten carefully negotiated marriage contracts. The financial arrangements surrounding marriage involve complex exchanges of property, agricultural products, and future labor commitments that could bankrupt families who overextend themselves pursuing marriage alliances above their economic station. Your bride price or dowry negotiations determine not just your marriage prospects but your family's financial stability for years to come. Since wedding expenses often exceed annual household income, while creating debt obligations that affect multiple generations of family members who inherit responsibility for marriage-related financial commitments. Female romantic agency in feudal Japan exists within constraints, so narrow they make modern workplace restrictions seem liberating by comparison. Since women's marriage choices are determined entirely by male family members who view daughters as economic assets, whose value depends on their ability to create beneficial family alliances through strategic marriage placement. Young women have no legal right to refuse marriage arrangements while possessing no control over their reproductive choices, living situations, or relationships with their own children after marriage. The wedding ceremony itself requires religious and social observances that must be performed flawlessly or risk invalidating the marriage in both human law and supernatural judgment, creating wedding planning pressures that would challenge modern event coordinators, while carrying consequences that extend far beyond embarrassing reception mistakes. Buddhist and Shinto elements must be balanced appropriately, while avoiding any Christian influences that might suggest dangerous foreign religious contamination, threatening social stability through spiritual pollution. Marriage expectations include producing male heirs whose survival ensures family lineage continuation while providing agricultural labor necessary for household economic survival, creating reproductive pressure that treats women's bodies as production facilities whose success is measured strictly through male offspring statistics. Failing to produce sons could result in divorce, abandonment, or replacement by additional wives whose reproductive potential might prove more successful at generating required male children. The domestic arrangements following marriage involve complex hierarchies that determine living spaces, work responsibilities, and decision-making authority within extended family households, where multiple generations coexist under systems that prioritize age and gender over individual preferences or capabilities. New wives typically occupy the lowest position in household hierarchies while bearing responsibility for the most demanding domestic labor until they produce sons who eventually elevate their status within family power structures. Extramarital relationships carry penalties that range from social ostracism to execution, depending on the social status of the individuals involved and the specific circumstances of their transgression, creating sexual morality systems that treat adultery as crimes against family honor, that justify extreme punishment for violations that threaten carefully maintained social order through unauthorized romantic activity. Historians still argue whether feudal Japanese marriage customs reflected genuine social beliefs about family structure or represented systematic control mechanisms designed to prevent individual choices that might disrupt established power relationships. But the elaborate marriage regulations suggest that romantic relationships served multiple political and economic functions that extended far beyond personal happiness or mutual affection between spouses. Divorce possibilities exist within legal frameworks that heavily favor male family members, while providing minimal protection for wives whose marriage dissolution typically results in losing access to children, property, and social support systems that ensure basic survival in societies where unmarried women face economic hardship that often proves fatal. Women who are divorced or widowed often become dependent on family charity that may not be available if their original marriages created financial or social problems for their relatives. The child-rearing expectations following marriage involve preparing offspring for lives of absolute obedience to family authority, while teaching them survival skills necessary for navigating feudal society's dangerous social and economic landscape. Parents must balance showing affection for children with preparing them for harsh realities that include possible early death, forced separation, or sale into servitude if family circumstances deteriorate beyond sustainable levels. As you contemplate the romantic possibilities available within feudal Japan's marriage system, you begin to understand why many individuals focus their emotional energy on religious devotion, artistic pursuits, or philosophical contemplation, rather than pursuing human relationships that offered minimal personal satisfaction, while creating enormous obligations and potential dangers that could destroy families through poor romantic choices or inadequate marriage performance. Raising children in feudal Japan resembles managing tiny prisoners whose survival depends on their ability to master absolute obedience before they develop enough personality to attract lethal attention from authorities who view childhood independence as early warning signs of dangerous rebellion that must be crushed immediately through educational methods that would horrify modern child psychologists. The moment your child takes their first breath, you enter a world where every parenting decision could determine whether they live to see adulthood or become another casualty of a social system that treats children like unfinished adults whose value depends entirely on their potential to contribute labor while avoiding behaviors that might threaten established order. The infant mortality rate in feudal Japan hovers around 50%, meaning that having children involves playing demographic roulette where parents hope to produce enough offspring to ensure at least one or two survive the gauntlet of childhood diseases, accidents, malnutrition, and social dangers that eliminate roughly half of all children before they reach productive age. This grim arithmetic influences every aspect of child rearing, from the reluctance to become emotionally attached to very young children to the practice of having many children quickly to improve survival odds through sheer numerical advantage. Your newborn survival depends immediately on access to adequate nutrition. In a society where food scarcity affects everyone except the wealthy elite, creating infant feeding challenges that test both maternal health and family resource allocation. Breastfeeding provides ideal nutrition when mothers have sufficient food to maintain milk production, but maternal malnutrition often reduces both milk quality and quantity, while alternative feeding options involve animal milk that carries bacterial populations potentially fatal to infant digestive systems. The naming ceremony for your child requires consulting religious authorities who examine various omens to ensure the chosen name won't accidentally invoke divine displeasure or attract supernatural attention from entities that collect children's souls for cosmic purposes unknown to human understanding. Getting your baby's name wrong could doom them to supernatural harassment that no amount of protective ritual can counteract, making the naming process essentially spiritual Russian roulette with your child's future welfare. Education for children begins with learning absolute obedience to family authority, while mastering behavioral protocols that prioritize group harmony over individual expression or creative thinking. Children must learn to bow correctly, speak appropriately to different social classes, and suppress natural curiosity about topics that might lead to dangerous questions about social inequality, political authority, or religious doctrine that challenges established beliefs. Physical discipline involves punishment techniques that modern child protection services would classify as abuse, though feudal Japanese parents justified harsh treatment as essential preparation for adult life in a society where weakness, disobedience, or inappropriate behavior could result in death for entire families. Children learned compliance through fear-based conditioning that eliminated independent thinking while creating adults who could follow complex social protocols without questioning authority figures who demanded absolute submission. Work training begins as soon as children develop sufficient coordination to contribute meaningfully to family survival, typically around age 5 or 6 when they start learning agricultural techniques, household management, or craft skills through direct participation in adult labor that would violate every modern child labor regulation. Children's education happened through apprenticeship systems that prioritized practical skill development over literacy, creativity, or intellectual development that might encourage dangerous ambitions above their designated social station. The few children who received formal education attended schools where learning involved memorizing vast amounts of information through repetitive copying exercises that continued until students achieved perfect accuracy or developed repetitive stress injuries that ended their academic careers. Educational methods emphasized rote learning and absolute respect for traditional knowledge, while discouraging questions that might suggest intellectual independence or critical thinking skills that threatened established authority. Childhood diseases in feudal Japan included many conditions that modern medicine prevents or treats effectively, but available medical care for children consisted mainly of adult treatments in reduced doses plus protective rituals that may have provided psychological comfort while offering minimal therapeutic benefit. Parents watched helplessly as common childhood ailments that would barely concern modern pediatricians killed their children through complications that adequate medical care could have prevented. Play activities for children reflected adult preoccupations with social hierarchy, military training, and religious observance, while providing minimal opportunity for unstructured, creative expression that might encourage independent thinking or personal development beyond prescribed social roles. Even children's games served educational purposes that reinforced cultural values rather than allowing genuine recreation or imaginative exploration. Historians still argue whether the harsh child-rearing practices of feudal Japan reflected cultural beliefs about human development or practical necessity. In societies where individual survival depended on group conformity, but the documented emphasis on obedience training suggests that childhood served primarily as preparation for adult submission rather than personal development or individual fulfillment. The transition from childhood to adulthood happened abruptly through coming-of-age ceremonies that marked children's assumption of full adult responsibilities without providing adequate preparation time for emotional or psychological development that modern societies consider essential for healthy maturation. Children essentially became adults overnight when family circumstances required additional labor or when arranged marriages created new household obligations. Family emotional dynamics involved maintaining appropriate affection for children while avoiding attachment that might interfere with practical decisions about their welfare, including possible sale into servitude, arranged marriages to distant families, or participation in dangerous activities that served family survival needs regardless of children's personal safety or preferences. As you watch feudal Japanese children navigate their abbreviated childhoods, while learning skills necessary for surviving in one of history's most rigidly controlled societies, you begin to understand why so few individuals develop the independent thinking skills or emotional resilience that modern psychology considers essential for healthy human development. Though the children who survived this system often demonstrated remarkable discipline and cultural knowledge that served them well within their society's narrow parameters for acceptable behavior. Growing old in feudal Japan means discovering that your value to society decreases with mathematical precision as your physical capabilities decline, transforming you from a productive family member into a burden whose continued existence represents a drain on resources that could be better allocated to younger individuals who might actually contribute something useful before they also become expensive reminders of mortality that everyone prefers to ignore. The moment you reach what modern society considers middle age, around 40, if you're extraordinarily lucky, your body begins its inevitable surrender to decades of malnutrition, back-breaking labor, and medical care that often accelerated aging through treatments designed to cure problems while creating new ones. Your teeth, already ground down to nubs from years of chewing rice mixed with sand and grit, finally admit complete defeat around age 35, transforming every meal into a gumming exercise that extracts minimal nutrition from food that was already nutritionally inadequate when you possessed functional dental equipment. The rice-heavy diet that slowly destroyed your teeth throughout your productive years now becomes impossible to consume properly, forcing you to subsist on soft foods that provide even less sustenance, while your aging body requires more energy to maintain basic functions with increasingly unreliable organ systems. The joint pain that began as minor morning stiffness during your 20s evolves into constant agony that makes simple movements feel like torture sessions administered by invisible demons who have taken personal offense at your skeletal system's continued attempts to function. Decades of bent-over agricultural labor have compressed your spine into architectural impossibilities that would fascinate orthopedic specialists if such medical professionals existed, but since they don't, you're left to manage chronic pain through folk remedies that range from completely useless to actively harmful. Your vision deteriorates according to predictable schedules that leave you increasingly dependent on family members who may or may not appreciate being designated as your personal seeing eye assistants, especially when your care requirements compete with their own survival needs in a society where resources are scarce and elderly individuals provide minimal economic benefit. Feudal Japanese eye care consisted mainly of hoping that various infections would resolve themselves while applying treatments that sometimes caused more damage than the original vision problems. The social status that took decades to build evaporates with depressing speed as your community gradually stops consulting you for advice, including you in important decisions, or treating you as anything more than a living reminder of human mortality that everyone would prefer to avoid contemplating. Feudal Japanese respect for elders existed mainly in religious teksin, daily practice. Aging individuals found themselves increasingly marginalized as their ability to contribute economically diminished while their care requirements increased proportionally. Your family's attitude toward your aging process reflects harsh economic realities, where supporting non-productive family members could threaten everyone's survival in societies where resources were limited and allocating food, shelter, and care to elderly relatives might mean insufficient provisions for younger family members who could actually work productively. The emotional bonds that sustained relationships during your productive years gradually strain under practical concerns about resource allocation among family members who might benefit more from investments in their continued survival. The medical treatments available for age-related ailments consist of the same dangerous remedies used throughout your life, except now your weakened body has even less ability to recover from therapeutic interventions that might kill you faster than the conditions they claim to treat. Feudal Japanese geriatric care involved hoping that supernatural intervention would provide relief, while applying increasingly desperate medical treatments that often hastened death while claiming to offer comfort. Memory loss arrives like a thief who systematically steals your most valuable possessions while leaving you aware enough to know what's disappearing. Though feudal Japanese society had no understanding of dementia as a medical condition rather than spiritual weakness or divine punishment for moral failures, the accumulated knowledge that represented your primary value to your community gradually vanishes, leaving you unable to contribute wisdom while simultaneously becoming more dependent on others for basic daily functions. Your skin develops the distinctive appearance that marks advanced age in societies where sun exposure, poor nutrition, and inadequate medical care combine to create visible signs of aging that appear decades earlier than modern people expect. The physical deterioration that accompanies aging in feudal Japan was so dramatic that individuals who lived past 50 were considered remarkable survivors, whose longevity seemed almost supernatural given the challenges they had overcome. The religious preparation for death becomes your primary occupation, as physical decline makes other activities increasingly impossible, though achieving proper spiritual readiness requires mental clarity and physical energy that aging systematically undermines. Feudal Japanese afterlife preparation involved elaborate rituals and spiritual practices that consumed whatever strength remained after dealing with basic survival challenges that became more difficult as body systems failed, progressively. Historians still argue whether the harsh treatment of elderly individuals in feudal Japan reflected cultural values or economic necessity, but the archaeological evidence suggests that very few people lived long enough to experience extreme old age, making advanced aging a rare phenomenon that families weren't equipped to handle effectively within resource-constrained household economies. Sleep becomes increasingly elusive as pain, anxiety, and various medical conditions combine to create nighttime experiences that make daylight hours seem pleasant by comparison, while the protective rituals that helped younger individuals survive supernatural threats require physical and mental energy that elderly people no longer possess in sufficient quantities to maintain effective spiritual defenses. The prospect of death transitions from distant possibility to immediate probability, requiring psychological adjustments that feudal Japanese philosophy addressed through religious teachings that promised better conditions in afterlife realms for individuals who had successfully navigated the spiritual and practical challenges of earthly existence. Your remaining time becomes focused on ensuring that death, when it arrives, finds you properly prepared for whatever judgment awaits souls who have completed their earthly obligations. As you experience the gradual shutdown of body systems that served you through decades of surviving in one of history's most demanding civilizations, you begin to understand why feudal Japanese culture placed such emphasis on accepting impermanence and finding meaning through duty rather than personal satisfaction, since aging in this society demonstrated with painful clarity that human existence was temporary, difficult, and ultimately measured by contribution to family and community welfare rather than individual happiness or personal fulfillment. Death in feudal Japan wasn't a simple matter of breathing your last breath and peacefully departing this world. It was the beginning of an elaborate spiritual obstacle course that could easily go wrong in ways that doomed your soul to eternal wandering as a vengeful ghost whose supernatural rage would terrorize your descendants for generations. The moment you died, your body became the centerpiece of complex Buddhist rituals that must be performed with absolute precision or risk, trapping your spirit in liminal states between life and death, while your family scrambled to afford funeral preparations that could bankrupt them for decades, while supposedly ensuring your successful transition to whatever realm awaited properly prepared souls. The death preparation process begins long before your actual demise, involving elaborate spiritual practices designed to ensure that your mind achieves the proper state of detachment from earthly concerns, while maintaining sufficient awareness to navigate the supernatural bureaucracy that Buddhist doctrine describes as awaiting deceased souls. This preparation requires mastering meditation techniques that most people spend lifetimes attempting to perfect, while your declining health and chronic pain create mental conditions that make achieving genuine spiritual clarity nearly impossible when you're distracted by physical suffering and anxiety about your family's survival after your death. The deathbed rituals surrounding your final moments involve positioning your body according to specific Buddhist protocols, while family members chant sutras designed to guide your departing spirit toward favorable rebirth, rather than allowing it to become lost in supernatural realms where confused souls wander indefinitely. The positioning must replicate Buddha's own death posture while maintaining proper alignment that facilitates spiritual departure, though achieving correct positioning proves challenging when death arrives through disease processes that affect body control and consciousness. Your final words carry enormous spiritual significance, since Buddhist doctrine holds that dying thoughts determine rebirth circumstances, making your last conscious moments essentially a final examination, where saying the wrong thing could condemn your soul to unfavorable reincarnation as insects, animals, or inhabitants of hell realms where spiritual suffering exceeds anything experienced during earthly existence. The pressure to achieve appropriate mental states while dying creates psychological stress that interferes with the spiritual peace supposedly necessary for favorable afterlife outcomes. The funeral preparations required after your death involve complex ceremonies that must balance Buddhist religious requirements with Shinto traditions, while avoiding any Christian influences that might contaminate your soul's transition or attract unwanted attention from authorities who monitor funeral practices for signs of forbidden religious activity. These preparations require hiring Buddhist priests, whose services cost more than most families earn in years, while demanding ritual observances that extend far beyond simple burial arrangements. Your body receives treatment designed to preserve spiritual integrity rather than prevent physical decomposition, since Buddhist funeral practices prioritize soul welfare over corpse maintenance, while following protocols that assume deceased individuals maintain awareness of their physical treatment during the transition period between death and rebirth. The washing and dressing of your corpse involves specific procedures that must be completed correctly or risk offending your departing spirit in ways that could motivate supernatural revenge against family members who failed to provide adequate posthumous care. The funeral ceremony itself requires elaborate processions that demonstrate your family's religious devotion while advertising their financial commitment to your spiritual welfare through expensive displays that often exceed their economic capabilities. These processions involve hiring professional mourners, purchasing elaborate decorations, and providing food for community members whose attendance supposedly benefits your soul's journey while creating financial obligations that affect your survivor's ability to maintain basic survival needs. The cremation process follows Buddhist traditions that view fire as purification that releases souls from physical attachment while destroying earthly ties that might prevent successful spiritual transition to higher realms. The cremation ceremony requires maintaining proper fires, while chanting appropriate sutras that guide your spirit's departure. Though mistakes in either the physical or spiritual aspects of cremation could result in incomplete soul release that traps portions of your consciousness in cremated remains. Your memorial tablet becomes a permanent household shrine that requires ongoing maintenance by surviving family members who must provide regular offerings, prayers, and ritual observances that continue indefinitely as part of their obligation to support your continued spiritual welfare in whatever realm you currently inhabit. Neglecting memorial obligations could provoke supernatural retaliation from your ghost, making your death a permanent addition to your family's religious responsibilities. Historians still argue whether elaborate Buddhist funeral practices reflected genuine spiritual beliefs or social competition disguised as religious observance, but the documented cases of families impoverishing themselves through funeral expenses suggest that posthumous spiritual welfare was considered more important than survival welfare of living relatives, creating economic pressures that prioritize dead family members over living ones. The mourning period following your death involves specific behavioral restrictions that affect your survivor's ability to resume normal activities while supposedly demonstrating their grief and respect for your memory. These mourning practices include dietary restrictions, clothing requirements, and social limitations that could last for months or years depending on your relationship to surviving family members and their understanding of proper posthumous respect protocols. The afterlife destination awaiting your soul depends partly on your lifetime karma accumulation and partly on the effectiveness of funeral rituals performed by survivors whose spiritual technique and financial commitment could influence your posthumous fate through properly executed religious ceremonies. This system creates ongoing anxiety for dying individuals who must trust their spiritual welfare to family members whose ritual competence and economic resources might prove inadequate for ensuring favorable afterlife outcomes. As your life in feudal Japan finally approaches its inevitable conclusion, you realize that even death represents just another survival challenge that requires careful preparation, substantial financial resources, and divine cooperation to navigate successfully, making the afterlife yet another realm where your continued existence depends on factors largely beyond your control, while your survivors inherit spiritual obligations that could affect their own survival prospects for generations. The final judgment of your soul in the Buddhist afterlife represents the ultimate examination in a spiritual system where every moral choice you made during your feudal Japanese existence is weighed by cosmic judges whose standards for ethical behavior were calibrated to levels of perfection that human nature makes nearly impossible to achieve while surviving in a society that routinely demanded moral compromises for basic survival. Your consciousness, released from its physical prison through properly performed cremation rituals, now faces Emma O, the terrifying judge of the dead, whose bulging eyes and fierce expression communicate that this supernatural courtroom operates according to justice principles that make earthly legal systems seem merciful by comparison. Standing before Emma O in his supernatural tribunal, you realize that this isn't just a simple evaluation of your lifetime's good deeds versus bad actions. It's a comprehensive audit of every thought, word, and deed you committed during your earthly existence, conducted by a divine being who possesses perfect knowledge of your moral history, while maintaining standards for ethical behavior that would challenge saints and bodhisattvas, let alone peasants who spent their lives struggling to survive systematic exploitation by feudal lords who treated human suffering as acceptable collateral damage for maintaining their luxurious lifestyles. The Court of Judgment includes multiple divine assessors who specialize in evaluating different categories of sin and virtue, creating a supernatural panel of experts who collectively possess encyclopedic knowledge about every possible way humans can disappoint cosmic authorities while attempting to navigate the impossible moral landscape of feudal Japanese society. These judges examine your record with the thoroughness of accountants auditing financial records, except the currency they're counting consists of karma accumulated through lifetime actions that seemed insignificant at the time, but apparently register on spiritual accounting systems with perfect accuracy. Your lifetime of moral choices, preserved in cosmic records that make modern surveillance systems seem primitive by comparison, reveals the accumulated weight of every compromise you made to survive in a civilization where ethical behavior often conflicted directly with family survival needs. The stealing of rice during famine years, the lies told to tax collectors, the failures to help neighbors who might have reported your assistance to authorities' very survival decision that required choosing between moral purity and practical necessity, now stands as evidence in a trial where the prosecution has unlimited access to your complete ethical history. The Buddhist wheel of rebirth, slowly turning in the background of this supernatural courtroom, displays the 6 realms where souls are reborn based on their karma accumulation, ranging from heavenly realms reserved for spiritually accomplished beings to hell realms, where consciousness experiences suffering so intense it makes earthly torture seem like gentle massage therapy. Your destination depends not on divine mercy or religious affiliation, but on the mathematical calculation of moral actions that accumulated throughout your lifetime, like spiritual credit scores that determine posthumous accommodations. The scales of cosmic justice that weigh your soul operate according to principles that consider not just your actions but your intentions, circumstances, and the moral alternatives available during each ethical decision you faced throughout your feudal Japanese existence. The judges examine whether your moral failures resulted from evil character, impossible circumstances, or inadequate spiritual education, though their standards for acceptable behavior assume access to ethical guidance and moral choices that peasant life rarely provided. The evaluation process includes reviewing your treatment of family members, neighbors, animals, and even insects, since Buddhist doctrine holds that all conscious beings deserve compassion regardless of their species or social status. Your lifetime of swatting flies, killing agricultural pests, and consuming fish creates negative karma that must be balanced against whatever compassionate actions you manage to perform while struggling to meet basic survival needs in a society that offered minimal opportunities for ethical behavior. Your religious observances throughout life receive scrutiny that examines not just your ritual attendance, but your genuine spiritual understanding and authentic commitment to Buddhist principles versus mere compliance with social expectations that required religious participation for community acceptance. The judges distinguish between sincere spiritual practice and performative religiosity that prioritized social conformity over genuine spiritual development. Though achieving authentic spirituality, while exhausted from agricultural labor and distracted by survival anxiety, challenged even the most dedicated practitioners. Historians still argue whether Buddhist afterlife beliefs provided genuine spiritual comfort or represented social control mechanisms designed to encourage moral behavior through supernatural consequences, but the detailed descriptions of posthumous judgment suggest that most people treated the possibility of divine evaluation as seriously as any earthly legal proceeding, with permanent consequences that could affect their consciousness for multiple lifetimes. The moment of final judgment arrives as Emma O announces your karmic verdict with ceremonial gravity that reflects the permanent nature of whatever comes next. If your lifetime accumulated sufficient positive karma through compassionate actions, ethical behavior, and spiritual development, you might achieve rebirth in higher realms where consciousness experiences less suffering and more opportunities for continued spiritual progress toward eventual liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth that traps most souls in endless repetitions of existence. If your moral accounting reveals insufficient virtue to warrant favorable rebirth, your consciousness faces assignment to lower realms where spiritual suffering serves as education that supposedly prepares souls for better choices in future lifetimes, though the descriptions of hell realm experiences suggest that this education involves torments so horrific they would break most minds before providing any useful spiritual instruction. The ultimate irony of feudal Japanese existence was that surviving life successfully often required moral compromises that made achieving favorable afterlife outcomes nearly impossible, creating spiritual double binds where earthly survival and posthumous welfare represented competing goals that couldn't be reconciled within the ethical frameworks available to people whose daily lives involved constant choices between physical survival and spiritual purity. The gentle darkness of eternal rest beckons now, softer than mountain mist, quieter than temple bells at dawn. Your spirit, weighed and measured by cosmic scales beyond human understanding, finds peace at last in realms where the harsh demands of feudal existence fade like morning shadows. The rigid expectations and impossible choices that defined earthly life dissolve into the eternal rhythm of consciousness, exploring infinite possibilities beyond the reach of social hierarchy and survival anxiety. Rest now, knowing that the greatest challenge of all the journey from temporal existence to whatever transcendent reality awaits beyond death has finally reached its peaceful resolution in the vast, compassionate silence of enlightened understanding.